You may have heard that having an abortion negatively impacts mental health and can lead to issues like depression. This is not true. In fact, a landmark study published in 2020 found that the emotion most commonly reported after a safe abortion is relief. Scientific evidence clearly shows that safe abortion does not cause more mental health issues than being denied a safe abortion. Of course, everyone comes to an abortion with different life experiences. A good indicator of a person's mental health after a desired abortion is their mental health before. What can negatively impact the mental health of someone who has had an abortion is encountering stigma and judgment. It's important to have accurate information when we talk about abortion. Go to howtouseabortionpill.org to read more.
Well, that video is pretty clear, isn't it? Having an abortion, you've got nothing to worry about in terms of mental health. You'll be absolutely fine. But then look at the NHS Scotland website, and it's got a section about emotional support that a woman might need if she has an abortion. Having an abortion can cause a wide range of emotions. Some people feel sad or guilty. So it seems like we've got a little bit of a contradiction here. We've got, on the one hand, people saying, oh, abortion, mental health, emotional effects, don't worry about it, there's nothing. And there's other people who are saying, well, actually, there is something to be concerned about. And this is a big controversy that's raging across the world, in the academic world, and beyond, the abortion mental health controversy. On the one side, you've got people that are saying having an abortion in terms of mental health, emotional health, it's no big deal, nothing to worry about. And that's the majority position. That's basically the official position of organisations such as the NHS. Then you've got the other side who are saying, no, actually, there are serious concerns. There are serious mental health, emotional problems associated with having an abortion. Now, generally speaking, people who are pro-choice tend to be on the no big deal end of the spectrum. And they sort of have to be. I mean, you have to be doing it. If you're the NHS saying, we're offering abortion, oh, by the way, we think it's actually really harmful to your mental health, well, that's not really a very consistent position. So pro-choice people are sort of forced into the, it's not a big deal, it doesn't really do much harm side of the argument. Whereas pro-life people, who are equally biased, I mean, let's face it, I mean, pro-life people want to find problems associated with abortion. So they tend to emphasise the evidence for harms, and there's plenty of it. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is try and make sense of this debate. I'm not going to go into great detail with particular studies, but I'm just going to try to help you to understand how and why the evidence is disputed and manipulated. And in this, I'll be citing two academic papers, but I'm not going to go into any statistics or maths. I'm going to keep it at a sort of descriptive level. Now, when I've been looking into this to make this video, there's a real sense of deja vu, because I've looked into the evidence and the controversy about same-sex parenting, where the raw data says that children of same-sex parents don't do as well on various measures. So what then the academic sociology world tries to do is they do their very best to obscure those results one way or another, to try to do anything possible to make it so it might actually be something else that's causing these worse outcomes. It might be the stigma or whatever. It's not actually the same-sex parents. Then I think about homosexual relationships. People in homosexual relationships, the outcomes for them are less good in many, many measures. So the academic establishment has to try to find alternative explanations other than just homosexual relationships don't work very well. Now with marriage, people, man and woman get married. That tends to be best for them, best for their kids, positive outcomes in all sorts of areas. But then the academic sociology establishment doesn't really like that conclusion. So again, they'll try their very best to explain it in terms of something else. Oh, it's really that rich people get married and rich people are happier and everything works out better for them. Same with transgender people. You get the idea. I describe this as statistical jiggery-pokery. So you take the bare facts that this thing is associated with this outcome. And if you don't like that outcome, then what you can try and do if you're in the academic world is you can use all your brain power to try and avoid the obvious conclusion that this is not a good thing because it leads to these particular outcomes. And the potential for jiggery-pokery is enormous. But this is not like hard science. This is more psychology, social science, and the number of ways of manipulating the data, designing studies to get the results you want, etc., etc., etc. There's massive potential for playing the system, and I believe that that's what happens to a very significant degree, and that's what I'm going to be talking about through this video. Now, I said there's a huge controversy, and there is, but both sides of the controversy, if you're talking about people who know anything about what they're talking about, both sides would agree that abortion is consistently associated with elevated rates of mental illness compared with women without a history of abortion. So that's the bald statistics. Women who have an abortion tend to have more mental health problems. That's just a fact. Both sides agree on that, but whether or not the abortion causes the problem is where the controversy lies. And the other thing is both sides agree that the abortion experience can contribute to mental health problems for at least some women. So they may deny that the abortion causes the mental health problems, but they wouldn't deny that it contributes to them. So that's the agreement, and then there's lots of disagreement after that. Now, as I say, so what we've got in this case with abortion, we've got a very biased academic establishment. A substantial majority of researchers and writers in this area, they're basically pro-choice. So they want to come to the conclusion that abortions doesn't really do much harm to women, and certainly they want to undermine the idea that abortion is harmful. So their mission is to try and explain away the evidence that there is. Now, in this area, the ideal thing to do to be able to do would be a controlled experiment. And as I explain this, you'll realize how ridiculous it is. It can never be done. So you take, say, 1,000 women, make them all pregnant at the same time, then divide them randomly into two halves. Half of them have an abortion, half of them have their child, and then you measure the outcomes over the next 30 years, say, to see how they're faring. Obviously, you can't do an experiment like that because it's unethical. Even if you could do it, it will be unrepresentative because it takes away the decision-making process, because that might be part of what causes the mental anguish, might be going through the decision-making process to have an abortion and the guilt about having an abortion. So that sort of controlled experiment can't happen. Now, normally in medicine, that's exactly what you want to do, to test if your treatment works or are there side effects to it. That's what you do. You do a controlled experiment. With abortion, you can't do it. So what we're left with is correlations. So you can see that women who have an abortion tend to have higher rates of this, that, and the other afterwards. But that doesn't directly prove that the abortion causes those things. Now, you may think, well, it seems pretty obvious to me. That seems pretty strong evidence to me. And it can be. It can seem pretty obvious. And it can seem pretty obvious that the people arguing against it are just doing anything they can to avoid the obvious conclusion. But in the academic world, if we've been scientific about this, you've definitely got to be open to the fact that two things might be correlated. More of one might lead to more of the other, but maybe one doesn't cause the other. Now, to illustrate what I mean, let's think about depression and abortion. Women who've had abortions are more likely to be depressed, suffering from depression. But which way is the causation? Might it be women more prone to depression are more likely to have abortions, and therefore after the abortion they continue to be more depressed? Is that a sensible explanation? Well, that's possible. That's possible. It's a reasonable explanation. Also, the trauma of having an abortion and the emotions associated with it could lead to depression. Is that a serious possibility as well? Well, yes, very definitely. So you need to try and look at the evidence to try and separate the two effects or work out which one's stronger. Now, another thing that can happen with research is, let's say, women who have an abortion tend to suffer from depression. Someone might say, okay, but they're actually nothing to do with each other. They're both caused by being poor. Women who are poor are more likely to have an abortion. Women who are poor are more likely to be depressed. That's what's really causing this result. That's called the confounding variable. And the third possibility you should technically think about is maybe this association was just luck. Maybe it just happened to be the case in the ones you looked at that there was more mental health problems among the women who had an abortion, but that was just a coincidence. But that explanation is dead in the water because there have been hundreds and hundreds of studies that have shown these elevated risks of mental health problems, emotional problems for women who've had an abortion. So the abortion mental health minimalists are trying to minimize the negative effects of abortion. They try and say it's not the abortion that caused them, it was something else, or there's a third factor in the background, or it's actually the stigma That's the problem. So, okay, women might be more depressed after an abortion, but that's just because of the stigma. It's the fault of people like me. It's nothing inherent about having the abortion. This is a bit like the situation where we had cigarette companies looking at the mounting evidence that people who smoked tended to get lung cancer. And the cigarette companies tried everything they possibly could to avoid that conclusion, and they played every trick in the book. Now, in a sense, that's good science. That's what scientists should do. If there's a finding that's presented, it's good for scientists to say, well, might there be another way of explaining this? Maybe if we look at it from another angle, things might not be as straightforward as they seem. That's great. That's what scientists should be doing. But the problem is when you get more or less a whole scientific establishment that's biased and is really resistant to the truth and will keep trying until they find a way to undermine results that don't fit. Well, they'll come up with the results, they'll do studies, the ones that are good, they'll be published and they'll be widely circulated. The ones that give the wrong sort of results, they might not be published, they might be ignored, suppressed. They'll question them and they're saying this wasn't very good research after all. And I'm sure in some cases as well, researchers will just make up the results. There have been cases documented where scientists have been caught doing exactly this, but I'm sure that's the tip of the iceberg. If you're highly ideologically driven and you're spending years of your life investigating this area that's very relevant to your fundamental beliefs, then if you get results that actually come out the opposite of what you wanted, it must be pretty tempted to just change them. And I think in some cases that probably happens. So as I said, the fact is elevated incidence of mental health problems in women who have had an abortion. But we can't necessarily just straight away leap to the conclusion to say, therefore, abortion causes mental health problems. We need to think about it a bit more deeply than that. But when we think about this, who bears the burden of proof? If you're the National Health Service presenting abortion as a treatment, and it's presented basically as a mental health treatment, to justify an abortion in Britain, the doctor signs off saying basically in almost all cases, this would be good for the mental health of the patient. But really, so if the evidence seems to be that mental health has worsened by abortion, it's maybe not so much for us to prove that it is, it's more for the people who are saying abortion is a mental health treatment. It's up for them to prove that it is actually beneficial. And as we'll come on to later, there's actually zero evidence that abortion is beneficial to mental health in any way, shape or form. Congratulations for watching this far. You obviously want to learn about this, you want to understand it better. So, on we go. Right, I'm going to look at two studies to try and elaborate on these points. Now, so this is the first of the two studies. This is the shorter one. It's called Abortion and Mental Health, Quantitative Synthesis and Analysis of Research, published 1995 to 2009. This was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. So the authors of this basically have surveyed research on abortion and mental health over that period, found as much evidence as they can, compiled it and produced overall aggregated results for it to summarize the massive research over that period. And the results basically were this: women who'd undergone an abortion experienced an 81% increased risk of mental health problems. The strongest subgroup estimates of increased risk occurred when abortion was compared with term pregnancy. Now, say if you say women do worse, have higher levels of mental health problems when they've had an abortion, you've got to say compared to what? Compared to pregnant women who go on and have the baby? Compared to women who've never been pregnant, or what? So it said the strongest effect was compared to women who completed the pregnancy, which is quite stark, isn't it? Because often women, when they've had a baby, suffer with postnatal depression, so they experience mental health, emotional problems at that point often. But even compared to that group, far higher, 81% increased risk of mental health problems among women who'd had an abortion. And also, the strongest effects were to do with substance misuse and suicidal behaviour. We'll hear substance misuse in particular coming up throughout the video. So in conclusion to this study, the authors write, this review offers the largest quantitative estimate of mental health risks associated with abortion available in world literature, Calling into question the conclusions from traditional reviews, the results revealed a moderate to highly increased risk of mental health problems after abortion. Consistent with the tenets of evidence-based medicine, this information should inform the delivery of abortion services. Now just compare these results with that video I showed at the beginning that just said basically there's no risk of mental health problems at all. You can just forget about that. So this is a very serious side effect of abortion that basically is underplayed when people are counselled with regard to a decision to have an abortion. And the authors here are saying this needs to be made very clear to women considering an abortion. So particularly in Britain, where the reason for abortion is, it says, presented as a mental health treatment, as simple as that. And it says these clinical assessments are not currently supported by population evidence showing that the provision of abortion reduces mental health risks for women having unwanted pregnancy. And that's the key thing at the heart of the justification and authorization of abortions, that continuing with the pregnancy will damage the woman's mental health. But it seems like here it's exactly the opposite is the case. Now, the authors also refer to 3 recent studies that have managed to sort of obscure, or they're claiming that, the mental health risks are insignificant. So let's just see how they approach those. Over the past several decades, hundreds of studies have been published indicating statistically significant associations between induced abortion and adverse psychological outcomes of various forms. However, the authors of the 3 most recent qualitative literature reviews arrived at the conclusion that abortion does not pose serious risks above those associated with unintended pregnancy carried to term. Right, so how did they manage to come to those results? And the authors of this study gave 3 reasons in particular. They said when they looked at the evidence, when they looked at all the research evidence available, they just left out parts of it. So basically the bits that didn't suit what they were trying to prove, they just didn't include them. And their criteria for deciding what to include and what not to include were not justified on rational grounds. So basically they cherry-picked studies that affirmed the result they wanted to get, only included those, and then presented their conclusion as though it was unbiased. And also remember I said that substance misuse is one of the most serious negative outcomes associated with abortion. But these studies that said, they're not really significant problems, they ignored substance misuse. They didn't include that, which is a pretty serious problem. Now you can see that, again, this is just the first illustration of the way things can just be manipulated without downright lying, but you can manipulate things to get the results that you want. And towards the end of this study, it quoted another recent, very major study looking, aggregating results about abortion mental health consequences. And the conclusion of this other study was this. It said controlling for demographic variables, in other words, you're comparing women of the same age, maybe same race, etc. When compared with women without an abortion history, women with a prior abortion experienced an increased risk of 61% for mood disorders, 61% increased risk of social phobia, 59% increased risk of suicide ideation, 261% increased risk of alcohol misuse, 142% increased risk of alcohol dependence, 313% increased risk of drug misuse, and 287% increased risk of drug dependence. They are pretty dramatic conclusions, aren't they? So this paper I've quoted here, it's obviously saying the mental health risks with abortion are very significant and we need to take them seriously. Then what happened? And this is just like when I was looking into, for example, same-sex parenting research. A researcher comes up with results that don't suit the establishment. So what happens? They get cancelled. People say, this research was rubbish. It should be withdrawn. Whichever journal published it, we should be boycotting them. And they'll just try and suppress the evidence. And that's exactly what happened with that study I've just been quoted. Here's an article from the BBC. Row over British Journal of Psychiatry abortion paper saw panel quit. I won't go into the details of the controversy, but that's what's happening. A group got together and basically launched a campaign saying this study is actually rubbish. For some reason or other, we don't like it, we want it withdrawing, we want it suppressing. And the reason is obvious, because it gave the wrong answer. It didn't give the results that they wanted to see. Are you sitting comfortably? We're into the main section now. I think this is really interesting, and I hope you will too. Maybe it won't be your cup of tea. Yeah, you're permitted to go watch something else instead. But I think this is very interesting. Lots and lots of points to come through here. So on we go. So the second paper I'm looking at is by David Reardon. It's published in 2018. And it's the Abortion and Mental Health Controversy, a comprehensive literature review of common ground agreements, disagreements, actionable recommendations, and research opportunities. And I think this paper's quite brilliant. So here we go. It said there are both abortion mental health AMH minimalists and AMH proponents. The experts from both groups can report similar findings from the same data, but will do so in ways that seem to either minimize or emphasize the negative outcomes associated with abortion. There's actually a broad spectrum of expert views regarding the AMH link. That's what I was saying already. So we've got to acknowledge that people are coming with this with very different agendas, biases, points of view even, and so we're interpreting the data very differently. So we start off with areas of agreement that abortion contributes to negative outcomes for at least some women. In 2008, a report from the American Psychological Association's Task Force on Mental Health and Abortion came to this conclusion. It's clear that some women do experience sadness, grief, and feelings of loss following termination of a pregnancy, and some experience clinically significant disorders, including depression and anxiety. And it says some of the clearest evidence from that is from case studies for people who counsel women who've had abortions, and that's what women report has happened to themselves. Now, a really big problem with research into abortion and mental health is selection bias. In other words, how do you find women to take part in your studies, to fill in your questionnaires, to take part in the interviews? Well, you've got to ask them if they want to do it. You can't force people to do it. You just got to ask them if they want to do it or not. And it says the risk of sample bias is especially high since questions about abortion are frequently associated with feelings of shame. And there's very high dropout rates from women at the greatest risk of negative reactions. So if you say, will you take part in our survey, we'll give you a questionnaire to do every month for the next how long, or every 6 months, or we'll do an interview, then who's more likely to say, yes, I'll do that? Probably the woman who's more confident that everything's going to be fine, and maybe she'll be the woman who's more determined to pretend everything's fine. Whereas the woman who's maybe thinking, I'm not sure about this, so I'm going to go ahead. Okay, do I want to go and have interviews about it and fill in questionnaires? No, thanks. I really just want to get this over and done with and forget about it. So that's a big selection bias. So the people who take part in this research are disproportionately the women who are not feeling particularly distressed about the decision. They're the ones who are less likely to experience negative consequences, and the ones who are more likely to cover them up if they are. It says some researchers choose to exclude groups such as women who abort wanted pregnancies or have later term abortions. Now again, that's probably the women who are going to experience more problems. So again, that's a way of diluting the research results in some way. So only include the women you think are going to be least likely to have problems following the abortion, and that's not fair. Now there's a big table here. I'll show you here. I mean, it's each line of that is a study that's included in his summary of the evidence, and you can see down the middle that there's a line down the middle, and then almost all the dots are to the right of it. Roughly speaking, that's showing that mental health problems have been shown up one way and another. About 3 of them, the dot is very, very slightly to the left. But we'll just look at his conclusions from this summary of the research. He said there are no findings of mental health benefits associated with abortion. And he says that because the 3 cases where the dot just showed maybe a slightly average result, the big line through it, which is the confidence interval, which is where it might actually be, because we can't be certain for statistical reasons, the confidence interval still went over into the negative side as well. So those studies didn't demonstrate benefits. They just showed well, the dot ended up on that side, but it might actually have been on the negative side. Whereas a lot of the other results, the dot is on the negative side and the whole confidence interval is on the negative side as well. So it is demonstrating a definite harm. And it says, well, the association between abortion and higher rates of anxiety, depression, substance use, traumatic symptoms, sleep disorders, and other negative outcomes is statistically significant in most analyses. Now, to answer some of the questions I raised in the introduction, some of this research specifically controls for prior mental illness. So it assesses women's prior mental illness, mental state, the ones who are in the control group and the ones who had the abortion, and then that's control for when looking at the results. So in other words, this takes away the argument. It's basically women who had prior mental health problems. They're the ones who continue to have mental health problems after the abortion. So those results, those studies demonstrate, prove, if you like, that that is not the case. It's not the case that the mental health problems were already there and the abortion sort of didn't make any difference. And these things followed the abortion, came into being after the abortion. That's been demonstrated. And what's also been demonstrated is a dose effect. So women who have one abortion suffer negative consequences. Women who have two suffer even more of the same negative consequences. Women who have 3 abortions, yet more of the same consequences. Now, if the argument was, well, the problem's not really caused by the abortion, it's to do with their personal circumstances, it's to do with their prior mental health conditions, well, that doesn't hold up. If every abortion increases the negative effects, that's very strong evidence that it is actually the abortions that are making the difference. Again, as I said earlier, substance misuse very strongly attributable to abortion. Why would that be? I think, for example, heavy drinking can often be a means of masking feelings or escaping certain feelings, and I think that makes perfect sense in this context. It says, some outcomes may appear to be less strongly associated with abortion because women are receiving successful treatment, such as medication for depression. Okay, that's a very good point. So if you do your research and you ask women, 6 months after abortion, are you feeling low more than 5 times a week or whatever? Well, the woman might say no, but that might be because she's on antidepressants. So that's another reason why the negative effects are going to be underreported rather than overreported. I mean, that's a big theme. There are lots and lots of reasons why these negative effects are going to be underreported and virtually none why they're going to be overreported. Now, something else that happens in this area is people produce a statement that sounds quite sweeping, but you have to read it very carefully to see what it's saying. Now, the American Psychological Association Task Force, they produced a statement. Just listen to this. They said, the relative risk of mental health problems among adult women who have a single legal first trimester abortion of an unwanted pregnancy for non-therapeutic reasons is no greater than the risk among women who deliver an unwanted pregnancy. Now, a lot of people would hear that and they think, oh, so they're saying that abortion doesn't result in any mental health problems, any mental health risk. That's what it sounds like, doesn't it? But look at all the qualifications. Adult women, single, first trimester abortion, unwanted pregnancy, non-therapeutic reasons. And then who are they comparing it to? They're just comparing it to women in general, which is a very unfair comparison. Well, so those qualifications they've put in there, let's see who it excludes. Well, it excludes roughly half of women who have an abortion who've actually had a prior abortion. Now, we've talked about the dose effect. That's a pretty significant omission, isn't it? So they're basically cutting out half of women who have abortion, and the half who are at greater risk are cut out by putting that single word in, first, abortion. They're cutting out the 18% of abortion patients in America who are minors. They're cutting out the 11% of patients who have an abortion beyond the first trimester. The 7% aborting for therapeutic reasons regarding their own health or concerns about the health of the fetus. And there's a very variable statistics for this. The pregnancies that are wanted, not wanted or planned or whatever, because that's a very difficult thing to measure. So see how they make a statement that's specifically designed to give an impression, and if the reader or the hearer is not particularly alert, they'll be misled by it, which is exactly what the American Psychological Association was intending to do. Right, he talks a bit about bias in the academic establishment. This is very interesting. So the impact of biases among academics on the interpretation of data and suppression of contrary opinions has been well documented. For example, identical studies for which the results are the only difference are more likely to be lauded or condemned by peer reviewers when the results confirm or conflict with the reviewer's own biases. So you've got two studies, the only difference is the results. The quality of the work is identical, but if the reviewers agree or the conclusion is in alignment with what the reviewers would like it to be, they're more likely to say this is really good, high quality work. If they're not so keen on the result, they're more likely to say no, that this is not so good, even though the quality of the research and the method is absolutely identical. In fields of psychology and psychiatry, such confirmatory bias may contribute to the promotion or suppression of research findings that favour liberal causes. In one study, only 1/4 of reviewers noted a major methodological problem in a fake study that agreed with their preconceptions, while 72% quickly raised an objection about the study when it was presented with nearly identical fake study in which the results challenged their preconceptions. I mean, clear objective demonstration that the academic world basically is biased. People will judge academic work according to their own bias. It's quite transparently true. At least one survey of 800 research psychologists found high rates of admissions that they or their colleagues would openly and knowingly discriminate against conservative views when providing peer review, awarding grants, or making hiring decisions. So that's the context in which this debate is taking place in the academic work. Work that supports liberal politics may thus be seen as unremarkable, whereas work that supports conservatism is seen as improperly ideological. And that's absolutely what we see, not just in the academic world, it's seen very widely as well. That's anything that's sort of liberal, progressive, secular sort of mindset, well that's sort of normal, proper work. Anything that's different from that, well, you know, this needs explaining. How come, what's driving people to produce this sort of work? And that's a very widespread problem. In addition to blocking publication of good research, ideological and confirmatory bias may also contribute to poorly designed studies and or carelessly interpreted findings that advance a preferred viewpoint. If you're designing a study, if you're choosing what questions to ask, at what time, to which people, and how you're going to analyse it, you've got enormous power over the result. Basically, if you pay researchers, you get research. And if you pay researchers, they can generally come up with something vaguely around what you want, especially in this sort of field. Not so easy in physics, but in sociology, psychology, there's a lot more flexibility, let's say, in the way you conduct research. Right, this is a little story. I'll read this out in its entirety. It's a great illustration. So it's an excellent example of this result-based bias was the 4 rejections reported by David Ferguson, former director of the Christchurch Health and Development Study, which followed 1,265 children born in Christchurch, New Zealand, for over 30 years. Ferguson, a self-proclaimed pro-choice atheist, believed that his data would help prove that abortion mental health proponents were wrong. In other words, he was hoping to minimize the mental health risks associated with abortion. But when he ran his analysis, he found that even after controlling for numerous factors, in other words, trying his very best to remove the association, abortion was indeed independently associated with a 2 to 3-fold increase in the risk of depression, anxiety, suicidal behaviours, and substance abuse disorders. Though his findings were the opposite to his preconceptions, he submitted them for publication anyway. Right, well done him, a man of integrity. It was then that he ran into a wall of ideologically driven rejections and was even asked by the New Zealand government's Abortion Supervisory Committee to withhold the results. How about that then? I mean, that's a medical scandal of the highest order, where you've got someone finding negative results, negative side effects, of a treatment that's been prescribed in a widespread manner, and is told to just shut up, we don't want to know about those, just don't publish them, keep them quiet. That's absolutely scandalous. In any other area of medicine, that would be absolutely scandalous. But with abortion, well, that's just what you have to do, isn't it? Because we all know that abortion's a human right and whatever, so you just have to go along with it, they think. Another factor that the author here brings up, I think it's very concerning. Often the abortion mental health minimalists, they publish their research, but then they won't allow other researchers, other academics, to inspect their data. What should happen with researchers? You produce your research, you draw your graphs, you apply your statistical analyses, you come to your conclusions, and then you make your data available to anyone else. Then anyone else can have a go at it to see if they can, well, either say, actually, we think you haven't analysed this in the best way, or they might find something in addition to what you found, or they might suggest actually that you've missed or overlooked what should have been the main conclusion. But in many cases, the abortion mental health minimalists do not allow their data to be accessed by other people, to be reanalyzed, which I think is a pretty serious red flag, isn't it? I mean, what motivation could you have as a researcher for not publishing your data for other people to analyze? Well, that's pretty obvious to me. Something else that's interesting about it, it says pro-choice feminists often are involved in post-abortion counselling programs, like the National Health Service, etc. They will have programs. If you go along and say, I've had an abortion, mental health problems, obviously they'll try and help. And in many countries, there are programs that try and assist with this very area. But pro-choice feminists are often embarrassed about them, and they don't want to talk about them, and they try and cover up their existence, because the fact that they're needed is evidence against their position that abortion doesn't really cause any mental health or emotional health problems. And so many professional organisations, including the American Psychological Association and a lot of medical organisations in the UK, specialist organisations and the NHS, have taken an official political position defending abortion as a civil right. But once you've done that, what happens is a subsequent acknowledgement of negative mental health effects linked to abortion might then embarrass them. And that's exactly the case with the NHS and with other professional bodies of specialist doctors as well. Once you've said, we're in favour of abortion, it's not so easy to say, we're in favour of abortion and we acknowledge it has extremely serious negative mental health effects. You can't really say that, can you? Well, once you've committed to being in favour of abortion. You might say, why don't they change their mind then? Why don't they withdraw their policy in support of abortion? Well, they can't do that because it's also so intense that they're feeling from their members. There will be rebellion in the ranks because they need to maintain that for political reasons. This is a very important bit coming next. Sometimes the results of studies are presented as, we've discovered what most people feel, not what most women feel when they've had an abortion. I mean, one of the favourites is, most women, their feeling is relief. So therefore, they're happier after an abortion. They feel great, so it's all fine. But there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, women who've had an abortion very rarely say there's one emotion that they experience. There's normally a range of emotions. Relief might be one of them, but there might be other emotions as well that are negative. And the other big problem with this in saying what most women experience, if you're going to say about most women, you need to, let's say you're targeting a group of 1,000 women who've had an abortion. If you're going to claim about what most women experience, then you need to know about over 500 of those women. But in these studies, virtually always, less than half of the women want to take part. And so you're only looking at 30, 40, 50% if you're doing really, really well of the women who's had an abortion. So your chance of actually being able to justify a conclusion about what most women experience after an abortion, well, basically you can't do that. You cannot do that on the basis of that evidence. But try and tell journalists that, because this is the way it gets reported in the media. And it's the way the campaigning groups present these things as well. Now again, this next point is very, very important. It's under the heading, the degree of reactions can widely vary and there's no reasonable cut-off for concern. Only a minority of women who've had an abortion have diagnosable mental health illnesses, but that does not preclude the possibility that a majority experience negative emotional reactions. So what you'll tend to get from the sort of pro-abortion side is they'll say, most women don't have mental health problems because they've had an abortion. But having a mental health problem, that's quite a high bar. That's been diagnosed medically as having depression or anxiety or whatever. But a woman can be experiencing pretty severe negative emotional problems without it being a diagnosable condition. Especially, for example, if the experience is guilt or shame. I mean, are they diagnosable conditions? Not necessarily. So if you're looking at diagnosis by a psychiatrist or by a doctor, you'd be looking at depression, anxiety, the common sort of mental health problems. But the problems associated with abortion don't necessarily fit into those boxes, so can be missed. Now, there's a couple of quotes here from abortion providers in America, so people who perform abortions on a huge scale, and this is what they had to say. One of them, sorrow, quite apart from any sense of shame, is exhibited in some way by virtually every woman for whom I've performed an abortion, and that's 20,000 as of 1995. The sorrow is revealed by the fact that most women cry at some point during the experience. The grieving process may last from several days to several years. The next one is a psychiatrist, a pioneer of abortion rights, and she writes this: every woman, whatever her age, background or sexuality, has a trauma at destroying a pregnancy. A level of humanness is touched. This is part of her own life. When she destroys a pregnancy, she's destroying herself. There is no way it can be innocuous. One is dealing with the life force. It's totally beside the point whether or not you think a life is there. You cannot deny that something has been created and that this creation is physically happening. Often the trauma may sink into the unconscious and never surface in a woman's lifetime. But it is not as harmless and casual an event as many in the pro-abortion crowd insist. A psychological price is paid. It may be alienation, it may be a pushing away from human warmth, perhaps a hardening of the maternal instinct. Something happens on a deeper level of a woman's consciousness when she destroys her pregnancy. I know that as a psychiatrist. Talking about women who've had abortions and seek support for it, it says publicity suggesting that abortion has no psychological effects may have the unintended effect of making women who do struggle with a past abortion feel like freaks who are unable to handle their abortions as easily as everyone else. I think that's a very significant point. I mean, that's basically gaslighting, isn't it? Someone saying, I really feel disturbed and I've got a lot of problems, mental health problems related to my abortion. And you're living in a society that says, well, that doesn't happen. People don't get mental health problems associated with their abortion. So basically, you must be wrong about that. It's not a very helpful response to someone with that problem, is it? Here says, the percentage of women experiencing negative reactions increases with time, along with a significant drop in decision satisfaction and feelings of relief. In other words, asked immediately after the abortion, women might, in some cases, might say, they're satisfied with the decision, feel relieved, but as time goes on, those feelings decay, and the feelings of regret, the negative feelings, get stronger. And that's very much a recurring theme, that this is a long-term problem that can emerge or develop over decades into the future. Subsequent reproductive events such as miscarriage, infertility, or even a wanted birth may unexpectedly trigger existential crises deeply intertwined with a nearly forgotten abortion experience. So now I've read this in other places as well. Someone has abortion, they sort of seem okay, but then a reproductive event, have a baby or whatever, something else happens and the feelings come flooding back and it becomes a major problem. So as though that these negative feelings have been locked away somewhere and a reproductive event, as it calls them, unlocks them and problems ensue. So similarly, life events that trigger introspection, such as the death of a loved one or a later religious conversion, may trigger a redefinition of past choices and experiences in a way that may include obsessive guilt and self-condemnation. So even life events, even like someone else dying, something that stirs things up can stir up a problem related to abortion. Now, religious conversion, Now, of course, what the pro-choice people say is that demonstrates that religious beliefs, pro-life religious beliefs, cause mental health problems. They cause women to be guilty. Well, and women's conscience causes them to feel guilty, I would say. This is a quote from a woman. I had an abortion when I was 22 years old. Now it is haunting me. I think about it every day of my life. I have so much regret. I wish I could turn the clock and undo my mistakes. I'm not coping. The guilt is too much. At that time, the decision was perfect, but now it kills me day by day. Please help me. I don't trust anyone with this secret. That was posted anonymously on an internet chat board. Now, abortion mental health minimalists might reasonably argue that it's the subsequent trigger, the miscarriage, the religious conversion, that's the true cause of the later distress. But efforts to apportion the blame for the true cause of distress over a prior abortion simply disrespects the real experience of women who seek, desire and need post-abortion counselling. Now, see, we've got the situation there. You have a woman saying, I had an abortion 20 years ago, 10 years ago, say, and now this other thing's happened. It's really stirred up thoughts about this abortion. I'm now really upset about my decision to have an abortion. And then the scientists come along and tend to say, well, I'm not really going to listen to that. I'm going to ignore that. That's not evidence of anything. What I'm going to try and do is do some research and see what I can find. But surely with mental health in particular, the primary importance is if someone says, I'm really struggling with something, there's something I'm thinking about, it's on my mind, I'm really worried about it, I'm anxious about it, I'm guilty, I'm ashamed, this is the thing. I think the normal response isn't, no, you're wrong, it's not really that. We're going to work out what it really is that's bothering you. I think that doesn't happen in other areas, but it seems that in the area of abortion, it does. While the passage of time may have helped to identify some delayed reactions, it would also miss cases where a woman's gone through a healing or recovery process during the time of the study. Again, very good point. So you ask women, let's say 10 years after an abortion, how they're faring. Tick the boxes, are you depressed, anxious, whatever. And some women at that point might be saying, no. But maybe they had terrible problems, but they received some counselling and support and they got over them and they improved. But then at the later point, they're just, no, it's all fine now. So again, this is yet another way that the problems associated with abortion are going to tend to be underreported in the research. See, in the research I've quoted, the problems are extremely significant, but these are just a lot of reasons why the problems are likely to be a lot more serious, a lot more prevalent, even than the research shows. Okay, yet another reason that's going to mean that the problems are going to likely to be underreported. So this is headed self-censure and defense mechanisms contribute to underreporting. So the psychological phenomena that he's talking about here. So he's saying avoidance, denial, repression, suppression, intellectualization, rationalization, projection, splitting, reaction formation may all contribute to a conscious or unconscious underreporting of symptoms attributable to unresolved abortion issues. Because generally, women don't like to talk about abortions. This is fascinating, I think. When women are asked how many abortions they have, in large-scale studies, you ask women how many abortions you've had, they'll answer the question. The questions do not tally with the statistics for how many abortions were taken place in the country. Women underreport them. So, yeah, it's just a fact. It just happened. I'm not saying every woman lies about how many abortions she's had, but the general trend, quite a strong trend, is women don't want to admit to having had an abortion. So maybe you could say that's a feeling of shame or whatever, I don't know. So if they don't like to talk about it, are they likely to want to answer questions about it and fill in questionnaires and have interviews about it in the years to come? Well, probably not. Which ones would most not want to do that? The ones who are feeling most ashamed about it. In other words, the ones who are most likely to encounter mental health problems in the future. So again, another factor that's going to result in underreporting, underestimating of the problems. So initial refusal and subsequent dropout rates usually exceed 50%. So any idea that you're going to come to a conclusion about most women is just wrong. You just can't do that. In the Turnaway study, I'll explain about the Turnaway study. It gets It gets quoted endlessly. That video at the start was based on the Turnaway study. And it compared women who had an abortion with women who wanted to have an abortion but were refused, basically because they were over the limit, over the time limit for it. Now, if you think about it, women who are over the time limit for abortion, what situation are they in? That tends to indicate something of a chaotic lifestyle. Things aren't, there are some other very serious problems in the background that prevented them from going for an abortion at an earlier stage. So I don't think it's a very good control group at all. But the result people get from it is they try to say that it shows that being denied an abortion is just as bad for your mental health, basically, or the same mental health outcomes as if you actually have the abortion. That's what they try to claim. But only 37.5% of women asked to participate agreed. Okay, so you've only got 37% even starting to be in the study. Out of those who agreed, 15% immediately dropped out before the first interview. By the end of 3 years, only 27% were still participating. At the end of 5 years, it was down to 18%. So if ever you see the Turnaway study quoted, remember it's data from 18% of the women who had abortions in there. 18%. So they're also basically useless. So that's a self-selecting group, and they're the group who are probably least likely to be reporting problems and the most keen to be talking about their experience. So probably the people who feel least ashamed of it, who feel like they made the right decision, so they're happy to sit down and tell you all about it. Whereas the women who are alcoholics by that point, say, for example, probably less likely to want to come along to an interview and talk about their abortion that's been plaguing their emotional well-being ever since. Yeah, Turnaway study. Remember that word. You see that study being quoted again and again and again. But then when it gets to newspaper headlines, they'll take the results like the Turnaway study, and the headline will be, "Overwhelming majority of women are glad they had their abortions," when it was a small fraction who agreed to take part, and that was their answer immediately after the abortion, etc., etc. But that's the media for you. There was one survey that was done once for women who'd had an abortion, and they tacked a question on the end. And they said, answering this survey has been emotionally difficult or disturbing. And they found that women who'd had an abortion basically tended to say yes. Answering this survey was emotionally difficult or disturbing. So basically, when it comes to this research, who's most likely to do it? The ones who don't find the experience emotionally difficult and disturbing, and women who've had abortions, particularly ones who are struggling with that, are less likely to fill in the survey. It tells a story to illustrate this fact. It was about an industrial accident that affected 246 employees, and the fear was that they'd been traumatized by it. They might have PTSD. So they said to the employees, look, you can do a little initial assessment for us, and then we'll see if we think you need any further support. Now, some of the employees did that. Some of them said, we don't want to do it. The ones who said they didn't want to do it, in the longer term, turned out to be the ones who'd been most disturbed by the incident. Okay, so it's not that they didn't get the support and therefore weren't helped with it. It's that they're the ones who were, from the very beginning, they were more disturbed by the incident. So following that through with abortion, the women who are most disturbed by it will be the ones who are least likely to participate in research. In a survey of women reporting that they'd sought post-abortion counselling from a psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker or other professional counsellor, 58% reported that the counselling was not helpful. Many reported that their therapists simply refused to seriously consider the abortion as significant. I was saying about that earlier. So that's women actually reporting that they go to a counsellor or a psychologist, psychotherapist, and it's as though that they refuse to take them seriously, that the abortions caused the problem. And then the women basically leave in despair and think, well, how can this person possibly help me? I'm on my own here, because they're ideologically opposed to accepting my experience. Which again, within counselling, psychotherapy world, that is absolutely anathema to them on any other issue, but abortion's a special case. So we're going to look at control groups next. So if you're going to make a comparison between two groups and say women who have abortions have more mental health problems than who? Well, the research has covered lots of different options with that. And it says comparisons have been made to each of the following groups, right? The general population of women, women who've never been pregnant, women who've no reported history of abortion, women giving birth to a first pregnancy, women having miscarriages or other involuntary losses, women experiencing both birth and pregnancy loss, women giving birth to unintended pregnancies, and women denied abortions. Together, these findings show that women with a history of abortion are statistically more likely to experience significantly more mental health issues relative to every comparison group that's been examined. That's quite convincing evidence, I think. I mean, this is some quite shocking statistics. This is from a study in Finland. A study revealed that the age-adjusted risk of death within 6 years of a pregnancy outcome was 5.5 per 100,000 deliveries. So this is starting with a woman who's pregnant. So if she has the baby, the rate of her dying within a year of that pregnancy, 5.5 per 100,000. If she has a miscarriage, sadly that risk of death goes up to 16.5 per 100,000 within the next year. If she has an abortion, then the number who die per 100,000 is 33.8. Remember, 5.5 for having the baby, 33.8 for having an abortion. Now, I don't want to be sort of overly blunt, but basically ending up dead is a pretty serious side effect to consider when weighing up a decision to have an abortion or not. In the general population, 11.8 per 100,000 age-adjusted women were expected to die in the following year. So in other words, women who have a baby are far less likely to die in the following year than the general population. Denmark, a similar study about the risk of death, and they found the risk of death after an abortion increased by 45% for one abortion, 114% for two abortions, 191% for 3 abortions. Again, demonstrating that dose effect. If this is to do with something else, some underlying factor, you'd expect that underlying factor to be fairly consistent, whereas this is showing distinct steps in the seriousness of the response with a number of abortions, which is strong evidence that it is actually the abortion that's causing the negative effects. It says declining rates of suicide attempts both after delivery and miscarriage, but a sharp increase in attempted suicide following abortion. That's it. It's very, very sad and very concerning. Now, I think looking at miscarriage and abortion is quite instructive, because in some ways there's the similarity, that there's the loss, there's the sorrow, there's the physical process might be similar in some ways as well. But the evidence is, as I say, miscarriage does not lead to the emotional mental health problems and anything like the scale that abortion does. Okay, he says, just as a comparison to a never pregnant woman attempts to estimate how closely induced abortion includes the goal of turning back the clock to a point where the woman became pregnant, a comparison to a delivering woman seeks to estimate how a woman's mental health would fare if she chooses to move into the group of women giving birth. Now, did you follow that? So his insight there is, if you have an abortion, I mean, one ideal would be it makes it as though you'd never become pregnant. So that resets the clock. You never become pregnant. Just get on with life as normal. Right? That doesn't happen. It results in general as showing problems. But you could also compare it to, okay, you are pregnant. Are you going to have the baby or not? Is it better to have the baby or better to have the abortion? And again, compared to people who have the baby, people who have the abortion have far worse mental health results. Now, another problem with the research that in many cases leads to underestimation of the negative effects of abortion is that women who have had abortions might end up in the, for example, women continuing pregnancy and the baby is born group. They might have had 3 abortions, but then they become pregnant and actually have the baby. So they might end up within the had the baby, continued pregnancy to term group in the research, which is obviously biasing the research because their negative mental health effects might be due to previous abortions. So that's going to decrease the difference between the two groups, if you follow me. And it then concludes the section by saying women who abort and women who sought but were denied an abortion. So this is like the Turnaway study, which is regarded as a really important study comparing women who went for an abortion but were declined because they were too late, too far on in the pregnancy, compared to women who had an abortion. It said these women significantly different than the average woman seeking or obtaining an abortion. Again, if you think about the situation someone must be in, that they didn't try to go for an abortion within in the UK, we're talking 24 weeks, in America, various amounts. So in other words, there's something going wrong, there's some issue that's affected them and prevented them from going for an abortion at the time when they know they ought to have done. So in other words, there's something going wrong in the background here. So this is not a sensible control group at all. And that's one of the problems with the Turnaway study. And the other problem I said already was the dropout rate was so massive that the results are completely meaningless. Another really, I keep saying this, don't I? I keep saying it, but this is another really important factor as well. When you see things reproduced, they'll say, most women who have had an abortion, they say their main reaction is relief. In other words, abortion is a good thing, makes the women happier, so nothing to worry about. Now, this next point is really important as well. I keep saying this, don't I? But this is a really important point. Because often when people talk about abortion, they will say the most common reaction of women who've had abortion is relief. Now, relief is quite poorly defined, but this is often asserted. But what does it mean? So if you say to a woman who's just had an abortion, do you feel relieved? Well, yes, in a sense, she'll be relieved that she's not going to have a baby. Okay. Relief that the dreaded medical procedure is now behind her. Surely everyone who's been through some sort of medical procedure, you're relieved when it's over and done with. You're relieved when you walk out of the dentist, aren't you? Relief that her parents will not discover that she's pregnant. That could be a form of relief. Relief that a partner will finally stop harassing her to have an abortion. Any number of other reasons for feeling a reduction in stress. So when people say women feel relieved, that shows that abortion doesn't do any harm. They're fine with it. It doesn't mean that at all. There are lots of reasons why a woman might feel relieved. But the vast majority of women reporting relief are also reporting a host of negative feelings at the same time. So the fact that relief might be a common thing reported, there are a lot of negative things going alongside that. So it's misleading just to say, oh, relief, that's the main one. That's the real one that summarizes what most people experience. All the case studies assessing relief have self-censure and dropout rates exceeding 50%. In other words, none of them justify a conclusion that that's what most women experience, or it's the primary emotion for most women. You just cannot conclude that when more than half of women didn't take part, that you asked didn't take part in your study. It's one of the most frequently cited case studies reporting that women felt more relief than any positive or negative emotions was based on... I'll explain this. So this is one study in particular where he explains how the method was skewed in order to make relief the most common response. So the women were given some negative reactions to choose from: sad, disappointed, guilty, blue, low, feelings of loss. So she'd give herself a rating on those. I don't know, say 1 to 5 on all those. Then there'd be some positive ones as well: happy, pleased, satisfied. So she'd give herself a rating on those. Then for the negative emotions, they were averaged to give an average positive emotion score. Then the negative emotions, they were averaged as well to give an average for the negative. Then relief was a standalone question. Now, you can see with that, if you're averaging things together, they're going to tend to regress towards the mean a little bit. You're not going to tend to get like 5. I'm giving 5 out of 5 to every single one of them, or 1 out of 5, or 0 out of 5 to every single one of them. That's not likely to happen. The results are going to tend towards being a bit middle of the roadish because you're averaging together a number of different responses. Whereas relief was one question. So that's a way, basically, of biasing the research so it's more likely that relief is going to come out with the highest score. Which is, I mean, that's absolutely transparent that that's just designed to give that that result. And then it gets quoted around the world in the newspapers and all over the place. But very, very unreliable. Yet another key factor that undermines the accuracy of the research, that results in underestimating other problems, is when people assess women who've had abortions, they often ask them about standard mental health problems, anxiety, depression, these things. But they don't ask them about what women report are actually the most common emotional problems that they experience. Sorrow, shame, remorse, emptiness, anger, loneliness, confusion, faint happiness, loss of confidence, and despair. And then some researcher comes along and tries to work out whether they meet the criteria for diagnosing depression or anxiety, which is quite a different thing. And in some cases, I think this can be a deliberate strategy to try and measure something that women are saying isn't really the problem. So it's deliberately not targeting what women consistently report as the negative emotional responses associated with abortion. This also makes it clear as well that in many studies that as time passes, the negative emotions grow stronger and the positive ones grow weaker. So another example of what can happen with the statistics. Most women are satisfied with their decision to abort. That's the conclusion of a study. But that study, only 27% of the women invited to take part actually took part. So massive self-selection there. But that's the way it would get reported. That's the way it would circulate on the internet. Most women are satisfied with their decision to abort. But then if you look at a different group of women, if you look at a group of women coming forward seeking post-abortion counselling and do your survey among them, you'd find that 98% of the sample, for example, in one piece of research, say that they regret their abortions. So you see how you can just get totally different results by picking different groups of women to ask. Now again, coming back to the burden of proof, it says normally the burden of proving that any proposed medical treatment produces real benefits which outweigh any risks associated with the procedure falls on the proponents of the treatment. So if you're trying to get some pill prescribed on the NHS or perform some sort of surgery, you've got to show it works. It produces a positive effect and the negative effects are acceptable. Overall, the package is of benefit, and then you can make this decision clear, give the information to the patient so they can make their choice. But it says there are no statistically validated medical studies showing that women facing any specific disease or fetal anomaly fare better if they have an abortion compared to similar women who allow the pregnancy to continue to a natural outcome. Nor is there evidence of any mental health benefits. So even in cases, I say, where the baby is going to be disabled, a very serious problem, no evidence that abortion improves the outcomes for the woman. That's quite remarkable, isn't it? And yes, I've heard from women who've really felt pressurized to have abortions because there's been a problem detected with the unborn child. No evidence of any mental health benefits. There are literally no studies to place in the benefits column of an evidence-based risk-benefit analysis. So if you think about abortion as a treatment, if you like, or what all this healthcare, it's a treatment. The benefits of the treatment for the woman who's receiving this alleged healthcare, there are none. There are no demonstrable benefits of this alleged healthcare treatment. There are a whole range of negative outcomes that have been recorded, but no benefits. So how does I think basically what's in the benefit column is the woman gets her own way and doesn't have a baby and she didn't want one. That's the only thing in the negative column. So in that case, you can't call it healthcare. Abortion cannot be claimed to be some sort of medical treatment that deals with a problem that a medical problem that the woman's facing, and it improves the outcomes for that woman in various measurable ways. That just is not the case at all. He says, it's the only medical treatment for which the principles of evidence-based medicine are routinely ignored, not for medical reasons, but by appeals to abortion being a fundamental civil right. So sort of ideological, political viewpoint that determines the treatment, not medical evidence. I've touched on this before, but this really rams the point home. It says that researchers in many cases ignore a type of evidence for causality which is unique to psychological diseases, namely self-aware attribution of causal pathways. For example, the evidence of a woman who says, "After the death of my child, I drank more heavily to dull the pain," is a conscious identification of cause and effect regarding her own mental state and behaviours. Indeed, in the psychological sciences, it's been the traditional practice to begin any investigation of mental illness by first listening to those individuals who claim that they have a psychological problem, which seems very sensible to me. But when it comes to mental health and abortion, people are quite reluctant to accept at face value what women report. And it says that the fact that so many intelligent, self-aware women attribute specific patterns of emotional distress to their history of abortion is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that abortion directly contributes to mental health problems. So to put that more colloquially, stuff your statistical methods and just listen to what women are saying and believe them. Now, the statistics back this up when it's done fairly and honestly and assesses the real issues. But regardless of that, you've got to believe someone. Let's say if someone said, you know, I've been feeling really down since a certain person died and I've started drinking more heavily, you wouldn't say, oh, no, what's the real reason? We don't believe that there's something else going on. It said women struggling with post-abortion mental health issues improve following treatment focused on abortion loss. Again, what a powerful point. So a woman says, I'm really upset, I've got emotional problems, mental health problems because of my abortion. Let's talk about this. So Mr. Counsellor, Mrs. Counsellor, help me to talk this through on the basis, let's see if we can solve this problem together as a psychological problem. And so they receive counselling or psychotherapy or whatever on the basis of solving this problem that's resulted from abortion, and it works. It works. So successful treatment is evidence in favour of a correct diagnosis. Would this treatment work if that wasn't really the problem? You would expect not, but it does work. And that's, as far as I can see, very powerful evidence that it was really the problem that needed solving. So as previously noted, self-attribution is not perfect evidence. Defence mechanisms often operate by obscuring the true cause of one's mental illness. But we would argue that a bias of defence mechanisms would be towards underreporting the effects truly associated with an abortion, rather than towards false attribution of unrelated effects to past abortions. So if you imagine someone might have some mental health problem and they're going to talk to someone about it, but they're a bit embarrassed about the real reason, so they make up a false reason. Is that really going to happen? Is the woman going to say, oh, it's because of my abortion, but it was actually because of something more embarrassing that she really didn't want to talk about it, so she blamed it on the abortion instead? If that happens ever, that will be a tiny, tiny fraction of cases. Much more commonly, if a woman's willing to talk about the abortion, then we should take that at face value. It says, even in cases where suicide notes specifically attribute a woman's final act of despair to her recent abortion, other pre-existing factors may also contribute to these tragedies. Yes, indeed they may, but the fact that suicide notes refer directly to abortion, then again, we should take it seriously. Abortion continues to be an experimental treatment, one for which any hoped-for benefits are unproven. I like that term, experimental treatment. I think that's quite a powerful way to put it. Another factor it talks about is that bearing children may actually contribute to mental health improvements through direct biological effect, by expanding and strengthening interpersonal relationships with children and others, and by behavioural adaptations that may replace risk-taking with self-improving behaviours. So instead of seeing abortion as a mental health treatment, actually having a baby has significant mental health benefits as well. I know there's postnatal depression, but looking in the longer term, there is evidence that having a baby produces positive changes in the mental health and general unfolding of life for women. Now, some studies have suggested that the reason women are depressed after an abortion is because of violence from a partner. That can be part of the result of it. But there's a really important effect to bear in mind here. I'll just read a little section. Interactions between exposure to violence and abortion on mental health. It's also important to consider that there may be a two-way interaction. So it might not just be violence causing abortion and the mental health problems. It might be that the abortion causes the violence. And it says surveys of women entering into post-abortion counselling reveal high percentages reporting elevated feelings of anger, rage, more easily lost temper, more violent behaviour when angered following their abortions, which can obviously increase incident rates of subsequent intimate partner violence. So in some research they say, a woman's had an abortion and her partner's violent towards her. So it's the violence towards her. That's the real cause of the mental health problems the woman's experienced. But maybe that violence is partly caused indirectly by the abortion. Because the abortion can, not in every case, can lead women to be more volatile and more aggressive and more violent, which can create these problems. So again, yet again, this is a way that the harms of abortion would be underestimated because of this consideration. So to conclude, I find this very, very interesting to look into, and I'm guessing you must have done too if you've watched all the way to here. So well done. I hope that was very interesting and useful. That's the first point of my conclusion. Number two, I hope this will enable you to counter pro-abortion messaging. So when you hear them saying, oh, abortion doesn't cause problem, women are fine or whatever, this hasn't helped you to say, oh yes, I know that study, I know what's wrong with that study, but hopefully it's helped you to know what questions to ask, and it's given you the confidence to reject the sort of claims, these sort of one sentence claims, it's all fine, women just feel relief or whatever. You can listen to that and think, yeah, I know how they come up with those sort of conclusions, and they're not true. That's not a proper reflection of the genuine situation, and I think that's a useful thing. As pro-life activists, we need to be able to do that. Number three, abortion has no health benefits for the mother. None whatsoever. No mental health benefits, no health benefits at all. The only so-called benefit for a woman who's pregnant is that she just doesn't have a baby. That's the only outcome. So there's no way that can be described as healthcare. It doesn't treat any problem. It doesn't alleviate any symptoms apart from having a baby. And as far as I'm aware, having a baby is not a symptom of any disease. Abortion is not healthcare. It does not have any positive consequences for the woman. Number four, serious negative consequences are associated with abortion, and there's overwhelming evidence that they're caused by abortion. Abortion plays a very significant part in producing these negative outcomes, and the evidence for that is suppressed, and I believe if it was talked about more openly, I think that would open the floodgates, and there will be massive numbers of women coming forward saying, yeah, that's the way I felt, I never wanted to talk about it, I'm glad this is out in the open now, I can get the support I need. I mean, that happens with lots of things. I mean, the general culture in the media, let's be more open about, let's talk about, let's hear about people's stories of what they encountered in this situation. That's generally what happens, but definitely not with abortion. And I believe if it did, on a significant scale, in public discourse, as I say, there would be an absolute flood of women coming forward, expressing their own concerns about their own experiences. Right, number five, primarily as a pro-life activist, my primary concern is to defend the unborn. I don't want people to be killed. It's as simple as that. And even if there were no harms documented to women who had abortions, I would still absolutely be pro-life. But the fact is, we're absolutely justified in saying we're defending the unborn, and we're also defending women from negative consequences, from harms as well. You can say that with absolute honesty. Number six, a pro-life message, even the most gentle of pro-life messages, often promotes absolute fury, shaking rage among women. I think in many cases this is women who've had an abortion, and maybe guilt or whatever other negative emotions are latent within them, or triggered by seeing a pro-life message. It brings it to the surface and they become very angry. They've been very much stirred up by it. So is that a good thing? So when we do that, are we being irresponsible by triggering these women into this very strong emotional response that was otherwise latent within them? Is that a good thing to do? Well, I think it probably is a good thing to do, because you've seen in the research that if a woman's got these emotions suppressed, latent within her, often they come out at a time of crisis, a bereavement, a miscarriage, or whatever, a really difficult time in the future. And then that's compounded by having two problems at once: the event and the abortion feelings having been stirred up to the surface as well. So surely it's better for women to have a bit of a challenge and for this to come to the surface at the time when there isn't a simultaneous crisis to deal with as well. So I think in that sense, that is a positive thing that we're doing. I think even without that consideration, we have to defend the unborn, and you can't do that without saying anything. So we have to be putting forward the pro-life message. But I think its effect on women who've had an abortion, who may say, who may become very angry or enraged by it, it's probably helpful for them to be brought to the point of facing up to those emotions now, rather than at a crisis time in the future. To say, if you want to explore options for healing and emotional and spiritual recovery after abortion, my wife Mary would be delighted to hear from you and have a chat and discuss various options with you. The email's on the screen now. So thanks for watching. Do join the Scottish Family Party. We'd love to see you at our events up and down the country, and we'd really appreciate your support. You can join via the link below. Thanks for watching.